Hey there everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. As a part of the conference room table build that I am doing, one of the primary build methods that I'm using is to create a laminate top out of hardwood. Now, creating a laminate top is something that's really handy, especially if you've got a lot of little boards, because it allows you to bring all those little boards together into a much larger board rather than trying to get something that is large and monolithic. Now, if you need to try and calculate how much wood you're going to need for this, I have a video for that. Go ahead and check that out. But today I'm going to talk about the method that I use for laminating my boards together so that I get a strong, robust, and lifelong quality tabletop. So the first thing that you want to do is get all of your boards laid out and dimensioned. Now, I already went through and I dimensioned all of these, and that's a whole process in and of itself. So at a high level, what you want to do is calculate the number of boards you need. Again, remember that I can walk you through how to do that if you don't know how to do that yet. Calculate how many boards you need, lay it out, and then what you want to do is dimension all of them so that they fit. Now, before you're putting anything together, you want to lay it out. As you can see, all of these are just laid out loose. Got a smaller piece that I can actually move with one hand. All of these are just laid out loose so that I can see what it looks like placed together. And what this allows me to do is both match the patterns on the surface the way that I want. For example, I had a lot of heartwood in this guy and this guy, some character in here, more heartwood over here, and it allows me to spread it across the table the way that I want, to design it the way that I want. But it allows me to see how exactly this is going to look, and then also look for gross errors that I might have made in the dimensioning process before I get there. Next, once you've got this all laid out, I am going to dry clamp everything together so that it holds everything in place, so that it closes up gaps like this, like that, because that is very important for the next step, because how I clamp this together is how it's going to be held together in the end, and I want to make sure that I reduce the number of gaps that I have all the way through here. Okay, once you have everything clamped together and adjusted, you saw me using the rubber mallet to kind of tap the end so that I could close the gaps all the way up and through. Once you have everything adjusted and clamped, there's two different things that you can do. One is you can either just say, yep, all looks good, unclamp it all, and then do a glue lam so that you glue all the different seams between all these different guys. Or what I'm going to do, because I have the tool on hand, is I'm going to use a domino to secure all of these together. Now, the domino doesn't really provide structural strength. I mean, it does technically provide structural integrity, but a glue lam is strong enough just by itself, especially when you've got 2 inches of gluing boundary. The domino primarily just makes sure that the surfaces all align with each other because it datums off of that top surface. So it just ensures that I get a nice flat surface, and it means I have to do less sanding in the end. So it just makes the assembly process a little bit easier. So you don't have to have a domino to do this. I know that it's a pretty expensive tool, but it does make these types of jobs a little bit easier. If you have a dowel jig, you can also use that, but you can also just glue these edges straight. So if you're going to be doing the domino method or the dowel jig method, you want to go ahead and mark a whole bunch of different spots between these different boards. Like on this board, I would say put a mark right here so that I know I need to put a domino hole on this side and on this side, and then the domino will fit nicely in there. So I'm also going to do it at the ends of the boards where they meet up right here to make sure that the surfaces are aligned between these two sides here and I don't get any weird seams. Okay, now that I've got all those marked, I wanted to walk you guys through a little bit of the logic as to why I place my dominoes where I do. So at a minimum, I need to have a domino at the end of each board. So I've got a marking all the way along on the edge of those boards. When I reach the edge of the boards here, all of those need to have a domino along the edge, along with the board next to it all the way down the edge, and then you've got the one that sits in the middle. So in the middle of the boards, I'm also going to have one. That gives me about 1.5 feet spacing between each one of the different dominoes. So then when I go about 1.5 feet in this direction, there is a meeting board here. So I know that I'm already going to be getting here, there, but I needed to make sure that I completed it here and on the other side. So basically what I'm trying to do is just make sure that about every 1.5 feet I have a domino that is spaced along my boards. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the dominoes that are near the end of the boards, those are going to be the tight tolerance dominoes, so basically nominal fit, so it's going to position it both left, right, and up, down. So up, down it's always going to do, but it's going to position it left, right because it's very tight. Whereas this one over here, I only really need it to control up and down because all the way at the end of the board, I'm going to have another tight one. So anything that's in the middle over here, I just need it to be loose. Anything that's here, anything that's at the end of a board, that's going to be tight. Now where it gets a little bit funny is on these guys over here, because I want to make sure that I'm positioning these. So even though these are technically in the middle of this board, I'm still going to do these tight. The concern that you can run into if you just do all of them tight all the way across is that you're going to over constrain the fit, which means that the little bit of mismatch that you have between your dominoes will mean that it doesn't fit together quite right when it comes to the end. So anywhere that I can put a loose domino in, it makes my life a lot easier because there's just less places that I can screw it up. But now that I have everything marked, I'm going to go ahead and unclamp everything, and then I'm just going to pull the domino out and time lapse you guys through me doing all the different domino cuts. And then I'll kind of show you guys what it looks like at the end. Okie dokie then, with all of the dominoes drilled, you can see a couple of them right here, tight on the ends, loose in the centers. It's time to apply glue. So I'm going to go ahead and deposit a domino into all of these. As a note, if you're doing something like this that has a composite of boards, I was trying to think through this, and I think the best way to do it is to get each one of the boards assembled lengthwise so that you've got one final length before you try and assemble them sideways. Otherwise, you got a game of Tetris going, and you may not be able to fit all of your dominoes into the different pieces that you have because you need to slide it over and in, and that can't happen if they're interfering. So I'm going to assemble the long ones first, and then assemble them all together this direction, and then basically, just like with any other glue up, make sure that you have plenty of glue all the way along the seam, and you should be good. While I'm getting set up for the glue up, I wanted to pass on some tips that I had learned. One is I'm going to be covering my black pipe clamps with blue tape to prevent the black from the pipe clamp from getting into the wood or onto the wood when the glue touches it. It's a big issue with the black pipe staining. If you can afford galvanized, that's great. If not, blue tape works well. And then the other one is to cover my workbench with some of this painter's paper instead of plastic, because the plastic is a pain in the butt to work with, even though it is reusable. It's just easier to roll out the paper. So the only downside that I have is that I had to move all my wood over, and then I'm going to have to move it all back because the only place I really have to set it nicely is on the table. So I'm going to go ahead and get that set up, and then we'll get the glue up going. Okay, now that I've got the pipe clamps underneath everything up here and I've got all of the wood set up, I wanted to give you guys a couple of tips on how I set this up to get ready for a glue up. So you can see this side doesn't have clamps, this other side does, and I like to work from the side that has clamps because I'm going to be setting everything up against this. So when I go through and glue everything up and then I lay things down, I'm going to be making it even with this side right here, and so this is the side that I'm going to start stacking on, and so I like to work from this side out so that I can basically pull everything back and in. Now, you want to go through and double check to make sure that everything is set up and oriented properly so that when you go through the glue up, you don't have to think, because this is where time starts to get tight. And you can, if you're going to have a really large glue up, in fact, this is kind of borderline whether or not I'd want to do this, but you can get some extended working time wood glue that will allow you to work with it a little bit longer before it starts to set up and get tacky. Okay, so my general setup that I have here is that I have the face that I'm going to glue up, and I basically just stack all the different boards like that so that all I have to do is face them forward as I go through all the way down. And so I'll go through, in this case, because I have dominoes, I'm going to glue in all of the dominoes onto this side first, because that doesn't matter if I lose my open time on that. And so I don't want to waste time putting dominoes in. It's really these large faces that I want to make sure that I have plenty of open time to work with. So I'm going to glue all of the dominoes in all the way across, making sure that I get glue on both sides or all sides of the domino before I put it in. And then I also put a little dollop of glue in the bottom of these so that when I push it in, it kind of pushes the glue up the side. So I make sure that I've got plenty of glue in there. So glue up all the dominoes, and then when I go through, I'm going to start gluing all these different faces, and there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. I like to just use my finger and basically just run my finger across the surface, because I find that it is the fastest way for me to get glue everywhere on the surface rather than using a brush. Another way that you can do it is, as I said, a brush, or there's a roller. Basically, you have a squeeze bottle with a roller, and if I don't feel like I'm going fast enough with my finger through here, I will pull the roller over and I'll basically just start rolling it through, and that'll get me up to each one of the dominoes and should cover it pretty well. Yeah. Okay, so because this is going to be a pretty tight time process, I am not going to go through and do a lot of close-ups on this. I'm just going to time-lapse through what this process looks like and then talk about it when I get to the end. Well, remember how I said you should set everything up and be really careful about the way that you put things together so that you don't run into any mistakes while you're trying to do the glue up? Yeah, I need to take a dose of my own medicine. This absolutely failed on me. I was trying to glue it up, and then as I got to about the middle, you might have seen it, things just started to fall apart because my dominoes weren't lining up, and I couldn't figure out why, and I figured, well, it's probably just a small tolerance issue. So I tried going through, and I cut a couple of the dominoes so that I could just get the boards together, but then whole entire boards were not fitting together, and so one of my boards got placed down incorrectly, which totally messed up the glue up process. So I need to add a couple hours of time to the project so that I can clean all of this up. Now, I think I heard this from Paul Sellers at one point. There's 3 types of mistakes in woodworking. One, the types of mistakes you can ignore. Those happen on pretty much every project, little nicks, dings, otherwise that you're like, I can't really fix that. Number 2, the type of mistakes that you can fix. Now, I think this falls into that category of a type of mistake that I can fix, or it definitely does. I just need to clean everything up. Table will be a little bit narrower by maybe 1/4 of an inch when I clean all of these up. And then the third mistake is the time you scrap everything and start over. Those are the ones you want to avoid. But as I get further into woodworking, I realize that there are much fewer type 3 mistakes. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and clean all of these up. I will see you guys back in just a second so that we can get back to the glue up. But for what I'm going to be doing off camera, basically run all of these back over the table saw just to barely, 1, to trim off all the dominoes, and 2, to barely trim off all of the glue that's there. My goal is not to take basically any wood with it at all, just basically get fresh wood showing, and then I'm going to need to go through and redo the dominoes all the way across here. But I'll see you guys just in a second. Alrighty then, a couple hours later, everything is cleaned up, and I went through and followed my own advice and did a dry fit with all of the dominoes everywhere that I needed, and I made a couple of changes that I wanted to talk about. One, the only dominoes that have a tight fit are over here on this end, so that everything throughout the rest of it is only moderating the height, and the rest of it can get squished in so that I can close some of these gaps. In this test fit, that worked really well because I basically get all of these guys aligned, compress this clamp all the way to hold everything in place, and then I can basically tap it in from the end while slowly tightening them down all the way to the end to make sure that things are nice and snug all the way through. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is during the glue up, I'm going to do it slightly differently. Okay, this may be an unpopular opinion, but on a giant laminate like this, the dominoes aren't really providing any structural support. So rather than trying to take the time to glue all of the individual dominoes in, which really hampered the last efforts, because even though I put them in first, I had to try and glue between the different spaces and it just wasn't working that well, I am going to leave the dominoes out entirely until the very end and basically basically just put glue into them, and then maybe dab a little bit of glue on top before I put everything together. But realistically, I don't need the dominoes for support, and when I've got nearly 2 inches of laminate space, the laminate itself, even without the dominoes, would be just fine. Remember I said earlier that if you don't have dominoes, you're going to be fine? Well, I'm going to live into that and try and save myself a little bit of time during this very large glue up so that I don't run into the same issues that I did previously. Alrighty, okay, so for take number 2, let's go ahead and get this guy glued up. Okay, that went much more smoothly than the other one. One of the things you may have seen in the time lapse is that all of the boards that were the same height I stacked together so I could glue them all at the same time. So that went much better. You can see that I've got nice glue pop out just about everywhere. One of the things that I did have to change right in the middle is that tapping with the mallet on the end was not enough to get the cracks together. So what I ended up doing was taking some extra pipe clamps, stacking them all together so that I could pull it together. And then once they were there, the tackiness of the glue along the entire joint really helped to keep it in place. I also underestimated the amount of bow and warp that I was going to get out of this. I normally on smaller glues or glue ups will do cawls that go across the top, which basically hold it flat. And part of the challenge, or that was with much smaller aspect ratio pieces for like cutting boards and stuff. However, in this case, I thought because I've got 2 inches across each one of these, or just about 2 inches across all these, it should be totally fine. Wrong. So what I ended up doing is taking a couple pieces of cutoff for the maple that I had and use them on the end with clamps to really pull it all together. Can't do that in the middle, but I just measured it and it looks pretty good. So there will be a teeny tiny bit of undulation across the table, but really not much at all. So even on a table this large, cawls are a must. So next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start trying to clean up the glue all the way across. Once you get to this stage and it's just a little bit runny still, not much, but just a little bit runny, you can take a putty knife and scrape it all off much more easily. And then I'll go through and spritz it down and wipe it all up so I can get as much of that glue off as possible while it's still in this nice gummy state as opposed to the rock hard solid state. Okay, so while we're waiting for that glue to dry, I'm going to go ahead and get ahead on one of the next steps, and that is to fill all the miscellaneous cracks that got left over. This is probably the largest one that I have, where I couldn't get the 2 boards to come together, but there's also much smaller ones in some of the other areas, and then between boards there's a little bit there. But with the epoxy, I can't have big gaps in the wood like that because otherwise bubbles will just perpetually come up and through, or even worse, the epoxy will just leak underneath. Also, it just visually doesn't look very good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this DAP or DAP, I'm not exactly sure how to say it, but this DAP plastic wood stainable wood filler, that's the color of the maple. And I'm going to fill all the cracks that I can see. I may need to do this again, but I figured I'd take advantage of the time that the glue is drying and go ahead and apply some of this wood filler in there. The reason why I'm using wood filler as opposed to wood glue, because another option is just to glue up those gaps, is because the glue will not stain in any way, shape, or form. And so I would rather have something that at a minimum will try to stain as opposed to something that will absolutely not stain. So I'm going to go through and fill a whole bunch of these gaps and be back to you in a second. With that done, all we have to do now is wait. I'm gonna wait for a full 24 hours before I try and touch this table. The epoxy, or not the epoxy, the wood filler should be totally fine by that point, and the glue should be totally set by that point. Once we come back, it's time to sand it up and then get the perimeter measured out so that we can attach that easily before we stain everything. Alrighty then, and 24 hours later, this is ready to be unclamped and sanded. Now for the sanding process, what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to do 80 grit all the way across the top to let it do all the work. That'll take any of the unevenness out between any of these boards. Then I'll come back and hit it with 120, and normally I would go to 220, but because we're going to be doing epoxy over the surface, I'm actually going to leave it at 120 because one, nobody's ever going to feel the actual surface of the wood, and two, at 120, it allows the epoxy to grab onto the wood fibers a little bit better than if I were to polish it perfectly smooth all the way across, and you actually do want that epoxy to kind of have a mechanical bond to the surface of the wood. So I'm going to speed you guys through the 80 grit and then the 120 grit, and we'll touch base on the next steps in a second. Here she is after 80 grit. It took off all of the debris and stuff that I had, extra glue and wood filler, etc., off of it. And man, it is so nice to feel the table as it's probably going to be feeling right in the end. I mean, minus the fact that I've got epoxy that's going to go on this, but it looks so nice, and it always just blows me away when I get to this step. But one of the things that I want to make sure is that I've got every ounce of wood glue off of this surface, because if I have any wood glue left over, the epoxy won't penetrate in that location and the stain won't penetrate in that location, and it will be very glaringly obvious on the surface. So one of the tricks that I learned recently is if you spritz water over the surface, not only does it give you a preview of what the grain is going to look like, but it also shows you any of the spots that you forgot to get wood glue. And so then you can go back and get those later. Or usually by the time you get to this place, it's so thin that once it's wet, it immediately gets, gooey and wet again, especially because I'm using Titebond Original, and then you can just wipe it off. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to spray this both to give a preview for what it's going to look like in the end, and then also to make sure that I've got any last ounces of wood glue off this surface. Holy cow. Oh, holy cow. I absolutely love this part of the process because this just looks stunning. It always blows me away when you actually get to see the wood grain pop a little bit and the colors pop in the wood. Holy cow. I'm so excited about this. Doing a quick overview, I'm not seeing any spots where there's any leftover glue. And if I can't see it by my naked eye right here, I will not likely be seeing it once we get into the epoxy phase. Plus, I still have to go over all of this with 120, and so if there's little teeny tiny bits of glue that I can't see, I should still be yanking those guys off before we go forward. But oh my gosh, guys, I am so excited for how this table is looking. And I think my client's going to be loving it too. Well, guys, I am excited for how this table is turning out. You can kind of hear it in my voice as I was closing that up. But also, this should go to show you that of those mistakes that you can make, there's a lot of things that you can recover from. So I don't claim to be a woodworking expert in any way, shape, or form, and I do mess up periodically. And I want to be honest with you guys when I mess up, because I think it's humbling for me, but it's also, I think, honest for you guys that there will be times that you royally screw things up and you need to find a way to fix it. And I think it makes me a better woodworker if I find ways to fix my mistakes rather than just throwing my hands up in the air and either starting over or trying to do something else. Because boy, if I had to start over every time I made a mistake, I would never get anything done. So anyways, if you guys have any questions about how to make a laminate table, I didn't go through the 120 because the rest of it's pretty much just sanding. Once you get to this point, it's just basically doing your finishing work. And so for me, there's a couple of other steps that I need to do to get it together, but I'm going to stain, I'm going to frame this thing with some walnut, and then I'm going to go through and do an epoxy. job. And if you want to watch me do that, go ahead and check out the videos that are going to be coming out or have already come out. I'm not sure what order I'm going to be releasing these in, but I'm going to be doing both how to do the epoxy, but then also for the stability of your table, it's recommended that you put C channels in the back, or I've heard it recommended online, and I'm going to be putting C channels in this table just to help limit warping and cupping that can happen with the table over time with temperature and humidity changes. But that will also be another video. But to get the table as a whole put together, this is how you go ahead and do it. So I'm gonna do the finishing steps last, but if you guys have any questions about this process or suggestions on how I could do this better, would absolutely love to hear from you guys. That's part of what I love about this community, is that it's a whole bunch of people looking to help each other out or learning or this, that, or the other. So if you have any comments, suggestions, or otherwise, go ahead and leave them in the comment section down below. And if you like the kind of content we're producing here at Northwest Craftsman, we'd always appreciate a thumbs up or a subscription to the channel, because it's what keeps it going and it's what promotes it in YouTube's algorithm and pushes us out to more people so that more people get to see what we're doing here. So thank you guys tons for all your support. Really appreciate it. I'm here and doing the YouTube thing because you guys are here. Otherwise, I would just be building this on my own with my earbuds in the entire time. And I don't know, it's kind of fun. I like doing this with you guys. So love seeing you guys around, and I'll talk to you later. Have a great one. Go make some sawdust. Bye.